Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Celeste Headlee. Grace Under Pressure is the show which deals with what's often called the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment, the conviction we have for others. And when you do it as a leader, you do it with a common cause to bring people together. My guest today is very special and special to me. Her name is Celeste Headlee. Welcome, Celeste.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Great. Celeste, many of you know her name. I have listened to her for years because she's been on NPR for many, many years. And she's also been on PBS, yes. So she is an internationally recognized journalist and author of the best-selling book, We Need to Talk, Have Conversations That Matter, Do Nothing, How Breaking Away from Overworking, Overdoing, and Underliving. And her newest is Speaking of Race, Why Everyone Needs to Talk About Racism. You might have guessed that conversation is her forte. And so much so, she did a TEDx Talk, which several years ago, it has now had 34 million views, folks, 34 million. I'm still trying to get my first TEDx Talk, and Celeste is in the stratosphere. So she's been on NPR for more than 20 years. She is now a permanent backup host and for many shows, and noted author, award winner, and done all kinds of exciting things. Celeste Headlee, it is a pleasure to have you as a guest. So
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Great. As a reporter, you have spent your life listening. What's the practice taught you about how we connect with others?
I think that probably one of the things that I've learned most deeply is how powerful listening is. It's really underestimated because when you are truly listening to someone, truly giving them your full attention, you create a connection, and almost everybody responds to being heard. Even when someone's angry with you, even when you're in conflict with someone, that simple act of hearing them solves a multitude of problems. So that's probably the biggest lesson that I've learned over these years as a reporter.
So how has it shaped shaped you as an author? Because you've got 3 books now and in your broadcast career. So,
as an author, I am an author in the style of a journalist. In other words, my books come with long footnotes and bibliographies because a lot of the research for my books is listening to other people, whether it's in the written form or actually doing interviews with them. For Speaking of Race, I actually included sections of conversations I had with other people because ends up to be the kind of author that I am. I want to make sure I'm visibly and transparently building on the work of others.
That's great. That's an act of humility, I will say. You're deferring to others and letting others speak, as you said, and listening to them. And as you do it, you transmute that as an author onto the page for the rest of us. So I want to kick off with your 34 million view TED Talk, which I recently watched, and it's 10 ways to have a good conversation. And when I was watching it, at the end, you talk about the power of listening, let the other person speak. So we have 20 more minutes, Celeste. The whole show is yours.
Thank you. Do you want me to just start? I can just start monologuing. It seems simple, and certainly in a TED Talk about conversation, you're going to expect me to say you need to listen to the other person. But I don't think people realize that you have to actually get training in order to become a better listener. It doesn't happen where you hear me speak and you say, from now on, I'm going to be a better listener. That's not how that works. Any more than you can go to the gym, get a great pump and be like, done for the rest of my life. That's me worked out. You have to actually work at it, and it takes effort. So that has to be you have to think of it more like a discipline.
Great. So in my world and human development, executive coaching, we use a term called active listening, which is prompting others. What tip is that? Something you do, or do you have other techniques?
I do. Active listening to me, active is a good word because you do have to be actively putting in effort. In fact, when you are really engaged in listening to another person, you do burn a trace amount of glucose. It's not enough to help you lose weight, but you are burning energy. So active is a good word, but there's all kinds of different ways that scientists separate different types of listening. right? There's evaluative versus transformative, versus interpretive listening. And I have to sort of, what I really think about, and what if I want to be a better listener, is I have to go back to sort of a meditation technique in which you train yourself not to clear your mind, because obviously that's impossible. You train yourself to expect that thoughts are going to come to your mind, that sometimes you might start to get distracted by those thoughts, and you have to learn how to let them go and then return to the person that you're listening.
Right.
Yeah.
You said something very interesting. Evaluative listening, I understand that. Interpretive listening, I understand that. I don't know what transformative listening is. So
as you were saying, evaluative is actually the most common type of listening we have, right? You're constantly wondering whether they're right, whether they're wrong, whether you agree with them or not. Interpretive listening, you're listening to them actively, but mostly you're listening for the purpose of being able to respond. That's the purpose of your listening. And so therefore, that's not actually great listening. Transformative listening is where you're entering into that conversation, listening to such a degree that you're willing to be changed by what you hear. Doesn't mean you're necessarily changed by what you hear, but you're open to what it is that they're going to say. And that's obviously the deepest level of listening. Totally unnecessary if your conversation is like, what do you want for dinner? Chinese food, great. But in other places where there's nuance or any kind of, deeper meaning, you want to engage in transformative listening.
So the words might be, I'm interviewing you and you tell me something about your background and how it framed you. And I go, I had never looked at the issue like that before. Would that be a form of that kind of listening, transformative?
Yes, absolutely. If you begin to feel an empathic bond with someone, maybe they are giving you their perspective, telling you about an experience they've been through, and you feel yourself really responding emotionally, that's also transformative listening, because your emotions are being transformed.
Great. Well, now that keys up your newest book, which is called Speaking of Race. Now that has to be, the listening must be transformative, I would think, between the races, I would think, because we all have our biases and prejudices and things like that, and we need to recognize them. So when we talk about DEI, which is a topic, of course, in my world, but what's the operative principle that you like to drill down on when you hear that?
So the reason I ended up writing this book is because we have basically been having the same conversations about race and engaging in this exact same DEI training for half a century. And it not only does it not work, but there's good evidence that it backfires and makes the possibility of discrimination higher. And yet we keep doing the same things. So I approached this book from the view of, okay, what actually does work? And how do we get people to engage in that kind of conversation, even though they may be afraid, even though they may feel defensive? Right. So when we talk about these conversations about race, yeah, it's absolutely transformative listening, but that transformation can take place before a word is spoken, because you mentally have to be prepared to understand that you cannot understand every single racial experience. You can't understand every culture. So regardless, you're going to learn something from the other person about their experience and their background and their perspective.
Well, that's so powerful. Is it because our failure to understand, is that due to our unknown biases, or the biases that we have and don't recognize? What does the research tell you, Celeste?
So there's so many things that make these conversations difficult. And you've just identified a big one, which is that every single one of us has unconscious bias of one kind or another.
Sure.
And yet there are people who very honestly tell you they don't have a racist bone in their body, right? That's not true. There are other people who say, well, I'm colorblind, I don't see color. Also provably, measurably untrue. In fact, race is one of the very first things that any human being notices, and it happens within a fraction of a second. Yeah. So these stories, these myths that we tell ourselves, that's a huge block to real conversation. That's not just true in race. That's true in any conversation. These fairy tale we tell ourselves about who we are and the world, that's not being honest. And a lack of honesty really does block
Well, that's in there. I'm guessing in these conversations because you said, it's always not always possible to truly understand another's point of view. And I've had these discussions, and certainly interracially and cognitively, as a person of who's white and of privilege. I'll be honest. I cognitively understand, but I have no idea what it means to be a Black person entering the room and being the only one. I have no idea what that's like. So is that the kind of difference that we have, or is that too simplistic, Celeste?
No, I mean, that's it. And it can get more complicated. Like, I'm Black and Jewish. I'm a very light-skinned Black person, right?
Yeah.
And so another person who's African-American, they won't understand what it's like to be me. I won't understand. I have never been followed in a department store. I've never feared for my life if a police officer pulls me over. So even though I'm Black and Jewish, I don't truly understand the experience of a dark-skinned African-American person. So yeah, it can get as micro as you want to slice it. But the thing that we all have to accept is that everyone else has something to tell us about what identity means.
So when you've talked about the last 50 years of the discussions we have had, and it's not working, what has been the failure, and what can we do to rectify it? So
the biggest failure is that we approach DEI issues as though it's a knowledge problem. So all of our DEI training is focused on this idea that if you tell people how bad and damaging racism is, or sexism, or any ism, if you make them aware of the suffering that your coworkers have gone through, they will stop being racist, right? That's not how that works. Nobody thinks they're racist. B, everybody knows how bad it is. They just don't think they are discriminating because it's unconscious bias, right? Unconscious, literally, they are not aware of what's happening. So instead of treating it as a knowledge problem, we have to treat it as a behavior problem. And so forget about trying to change people's values, which is impossible. Forget about trying to change their unconscious bias, which again, nearly impossible, but just focus on behaviors and changing systems. That's how you make real progress. We know a lot about behavioral science.
Right. Well, that's actually what that's the root of executive coaching, any kind, or cognitive behavior therapy is we don't change we would say we don't change personality, we change behaviors. So
exactly.
I do want to push back a little bit because there are things that I have not been aware of that people of color or different races experience in the workplace until, shame on me, more recently. So I am glad that I know about that. And so what's the next step?
So there are absolutely data points, history, that's very important. But knowing why it's not okay to touch a Black woman's hair doesn't make someone less likely to hire a white male over that Black woman. That's not how that works. That may help you in your personal behavior, right? But the way to do that is say, it doesn't matter whether you understand why you're not. We're happy to explain to you, but you don't touch anybody else's hair. In fact, keep your hands off their body, full stop.
Good advice.
But, in terms of making real substantive change, that's when you have to do the kind of reform that most executives don't want to do because it's hard and it's transformational. Okay. It's unfortunate because that kind of change can really bring a cascade of benefits, but they don't normally want to change the way things are done.
Okay. Well, I'm going to push on that a little bit because I would like to say I don't want to use the word race blind because that's a misnomer that we are not. But I will say I want to say an inclusionary person, a person who is an ally, a person who is a sponsor. And I know a great many executives who are of that male who do that. So I want to push you a little bit on that point. So
I mean, I don't doubt that at all. I've met many people who are fully on board absolutely committed. And yet, research has shown that after a lot of money invested, at a lot of time and effort invested, there has been no real change in the number of people promoted to higher wages. There's no change in the amount of turnover among people of color or among women. There's an interesting thing I wrote a book that was sort of a companion to Speaking of Race that was on sexism. The title of the book is You're Cute When You're Mad. And
great title, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I profile a law firm that invested a lot of money into creating an inclusive and equitable performance review system. Absolutely the best of intentions, only to find out that because of unconscious bias, even that very carefully crafted system absolutely advantaged the men and disadvantaged the women. So
no, and sadly, it doesn't surprise me. But and I hate to say the cliche, throwing money at the problem, but I want to say we're not that different. And what I mean by if you're a white male and privileged, you see the world one way, and the stereotype is, well, I did it, why can't you? That type of thing, and that's outright stupidity. Okay, but very many are well intended and want and strive and do the right thing. Now, I think within their organization, they're champions. But if you want to speak more at a macro level, I cannot disagree with what you're saying, because the numbers prove it. So,
yeah, and again, even among those people who are fully committed, and I know many of them. Look, I'll take NPR as an example. Our current CEO is absolutely, one of my African American friends called him the most woke white man she ever met, and she was being serious. Like, he is completely on board. We still have not been able to really push the needle. And that's because, again, we are not setting into place new systems, completely changing the way that we do things. And I'll give you another example. In public radio, there's a real belief in meritocracy. Mm-hmm. But the research shows that the stronger your belief in meritocracy, the more likely there is to be discrimination present in your workplace. And the reason for that is, in order to believe in meritocracy, you have to also believe that white men are just better than everybody else. That's the only way that makes sense. Otherwise, if that's not true, then meritocracy does not exist. And so any organization that emphasizes meritocracy is more likely to engage in discrimination. These are the kind of sort of changes where you have to dump some of those old values.
Well, yes, a meritocratic society has benefited white males more than anyone else, no question, and has been uneven. And we started with a leg up over white women, and not to mention people of color. So I understand that completely. So when we're doing this, but it does come down to at least personal behavior and treating people. It's like the executive you talked about. I'm sure that person acts with an open mind and an open heart toward all people, and so that's a challenge too. And then so. Tell me a little more about that.
So yes, except that, again, all of us have unconscious bias. Mm-hmm. There's even a great deal of proof showing that, because this message that Black people are inferior in the United States, because it's so pervasive, even African Americans often have an unconscious bias against their own race. So what you are doing consciously is not what's happening in your unconscious. Neuroscientists have estimated that 98% of our thought is unconscious, mm-hmm. which means you don't have control over almost all of the things you're thinking. And unless you just accept that and put systems into place that are fail safes, where other people are constantly checking in, making sure there's checklists and factors and systems, unless you have those things in place, your subconscious bias will fail you. Yeah. No matter how consciously meritocratic, no matter how consciously inclusive and equitable you want to be.
Okay. Now, let me ask you, this a thought popped into my mind because your secondary book, but your follow-on book was You're Cute When You're Mad. Is it easier to talk about sexism than racism? And is it easier to address it that way? I just my thought came to mind. So
yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right here, and your thought is accurate. There's good research to show that people do have less trouble talking about sexism than racism. On the other hand, it's also true that most people think sexism is less serious.
no, I definitely would think that. Yes.
Yeah. So it makes them both have their own special things that make them difficult, right? Racism is very serious. People understand that because it's serious, because it's tied up in our identities and who we think we are. It makes it difficult to talk about. On the other hand, sexism, everybody has a joke about their ex-wife or their girlfriend or their mother-in-law that's horribly sexist.
Not me, Celeste. Of course.
But you know what I'm saying, yeah.
No, but humor is wonderful. It breaks down there. I mean, derogatory humor, of course not. Put down humor, no. But laughing at one another is a great thing. I firmly believe in that type of thing. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Although, humor is great as long as it's not a product of unconscious bias.
Well, it probably is. So that's a whole other story. But anyway, now let me ask you this, because I heard it somewhere. And when we talk about sort of the issue that isn't critical race theory, and it's, quote, being taught in schools, which of course it is not. And then some have said that the kids themselves, and maybe we're talking teens, aren't really paying attention to it. So they're more unbiased than we are. Is that accurate, or is that a preconception, Celeste? So
both. I think, we know that kids begin to adopt the biased beliefs of their parents and grandparents, the guardians, by like age 3, 4, 5.
Okay.
So, and they unless they take action to unseat those prejudices, they will simply harden over time. Right. So we've often had this idea that racism will age out. That is never going to be true.
Yeah. Well, that was my hope. So, as a grandfather of 2 biracial grandchildren, that is my hope. But we have to it is an active process. And I think that's maybe why you have written. Well, I'm asking you, did you write this book because you wanted to activate the issue and encourage dialogue and action? Is this what drove you to write this, Celeste? So,
yeah. What I did was I found, I realized that there was something missing. There's so many books about talking about racism. The vast majority of them deal with the history of racism, right? Educating people about the history, the impacts, all of those things. And those are super important. But what was missing was just a guide that step by step walks you through the best research, the best experience I can give you on how to literally get through the conversation. If you say the wrong thing, here's what you do. If you are beginning to argue with someone and they're getting defensive or you're getting defensive, here's what you do. Here's how you prepare your mind for the conversation, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what this book is meant to do. And yes, it's supposed to encourage conversation, because I hope that if I demystify this process, if I tell people not that if you make a mistake, it's the worst thing ever and you're a racist, but you're going to make a mistake, period. Here's what you do when it happens. That perhaps I can encourage people to have more conversations just because they're a little less fearful.
Okay. Let me ask you something. Do we need to neutralize the word racist? And I don't mean it, I'm not talking segregation. I don't mean that type of thing, but the fact that all of us may have racial bias. Just if we neutralize the word, does it make it more accessible to open our minds or hearts to people of difference from us, or is that too Pollyannish? So
no, I don't know if it opens up our minds, but I will say this, that I think we need to just stop worrying about calling people racist. Now, I want to separate out politicians here, because they're in a place of responsibility. They have literally asked to be put there, and therefore there's a different standard. If a politician is racist, you just need to just call them racist. Go ahead.
Oh no, and that's a fair point, because they're trafficking in it, and to use a marketing term, they're merchandising it. So
yes, they are. In fact, there's articles today about a series of ads that Stephen Miller's group is running that say something like that talk about how white people are being targeted by reverse racism. I will say, measurably, evidentiarily, reverse racism is fake. It's as real as a unicorn. It doesn't exist.
Right.
But for everybody else, the racist has become such a loaded word.
Exactly. Yes.
That it doesn't mean anything anymore. Right? It doesn't.
I think it could be very hurtful, and it could harm people if we were in some kind of a group and we said, well, that's a very racist thing, we wouldn't want to be called that, and it may act as be defensive, and then if there's no further conversation, then we walk away damaged. And so that's kind of what I was getting at. So rather than name them.
And I'm not the only person who have said this. We have many people, like, for example, I'll quote Isabel Wilkerson in her excellent book, Caste, when she said, resistance to the word often derails any discussion of the underlying behavior it is meant to describe, thus eroding it of meaning. And I think that's true.
Right. Okay. Well, Celeste, we are racing along in our program, and I could keep going. But as you know, I ask every guest a story about grace. Theme of our show, Grace Under Pressure. And do you have a story that you would like to share with us? So.
Yeah, I'll tell a story about my son. When he was young, I think he was maybe in first or second grade, and I had to be an MC at a huge city festival in Detroit. And as a bribe, I told him he could pick out any festival food if he was good. And he waited all day long, and he picked out his festival food. He got one of those great big bratwursts with all the peppers and everything on the bun. And he took a bite out of it, and he saw a man digging out of the trash. And he said, "Why is he digging in the trash?" And I said, "Well, he's hungry." And Grant wrapped up his food and handed it to the guy. Without even thinking about it.
Wow, what a kid. That's a lovely story about grace. And that's what it is. And bless his little heart. And and so that's a good, I can think that there's some good mom behind that one too. So you done raised him well.
I hope so. I hope that's true. Thank you.
But to continue on, it's the theme of your work as a journalist, but as a broadcast journalist, is conversation. That's the theme of your book, speaking of race, and you're cute when you're mad type things, and all the other stuff you talk. So I guess, does it come back to listening and active listening, or however you describe it? So,
I mean, I think that you have to, in order to be a good conversationalist, you can't be a good talker. It's not because you're funny and you know lots of stuff and you tell good stories. It's because you're as good at listening as you are at talking. And that is rare.
It's hard, because there's something called, you might have heard of it, called ego.
What?
Yeah. And so, no, absolutely. And when we put our ego ahead, we're talking and not listening. There's the old cliche, but it's truism. You have two ears and one mouth, use them proportionally. That's always good advice for leaders. So, and
that's absolutely true.
The best advice. So, Celeste, how can people find you? So,
the easiest way is to go to my website. It's just celesteheadlee.com. I have a newsletter that comes out every week. It's free. And I'm active on Twitter. We'll see if that remains true.
Well,
but
I think we're all waiting for that one. Celeste Headlee, it has been such a privilege and an honor to speak to you. Thank you for sharing the stories of the work that you have done and the great books you've authored. So with that, we will close out.